Um, Let me introduce our speaker and enjoy our talk. So I am Ron Stella of the Department of Central Eurasian Studies. We are happy to host today Ian MacCormack, who will be speaking about the intellectual and material productions of the Tibetan Buddhist state. Dr. MacCormack, who completed his PhD in the history of religion at Harvard in 2018, is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, where he also teaches courses on Buddhism and Tibetan cultural history. He is the author of several important publications, including 3 articles published just last year in 2020 in such venues as the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies, and the Paris-based Revue d'études Tibetan. Following the talk, we'll have limited time for questions and answers. Actually, several of us have to go and teach at 1:15, including myself. So if you do have questions, simply type the word question in the chat or send it directly to me. And we, of course, request that you keep your questions or comments brief. So, Ian, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. And just first, I want to thank you all for coming. This is a really fantastic audience. Looking at my gallery view of all the people in attendance, I see a couple old friends, which is really nice. I especially want to thank Ron and Marianne and Professor Kara for the extra time they've taken. And so just to give you a heads up, in this talk, I wanted to try out some new material. So I'm going to roughly split my talk in half. And first, I'm going to give you a broader overview of my current project from a wider angle. And then I'm going to spend the second half and zoom in on some new research and talk a little bit about that and share with you some of the thoughts I've had about that. So I'm going to jump over. I have a series of slides. Oh, April, I think you need to give me access to screen sharing. If you're there. Oh, there we go. So hopefully, Ron, can you just give me a thumbs up that you see the good? So let's get started. So my work straddles the study of Buddhism and the study of Tibetan literature and social and political history. My current research is centered on the early modern central Tibetan state, which was founded in 1642 after a campaign to unify central Tibet. And it elevated a religious magnate, the 5th Dalai Lama, into a position of political authority. Now, I focus especially on the last quarter century, the period of the formal transition of authority from the Dalai Lama to his chosen successor, and the productive activities of this era after his death, including large-scale works, both textual, material, and practical. In a word, I'm interested in the cultural forms of the state in this era, unpacking the abundant but still often unstudied sources and trying to make sense of these complex works intellectually and in their context. And in doing this, I try to speak at once to Tibetan history, Buddhist studies, and coming out of my own disciplinary background to thinking about religion and politics, especially kingship. So let me illustrate this with a few pictures. So this is one scene in a larger series of scenes in a mural that's painted around the inside of the veranda on the 3rd floor of the Red Palace, the Potong Marpo, of the larger royal palace. So it's actually a painting inside this very building that is itself depicting. And it shows the work in progress on the massive reconstruction effort that was launched in 1690, effectively doubling the size of the older fort and reorganizing it around a new central monument, the golden tomb of the Dalai Lama, which was being built at the same time. And here I've just shown a couple close-ups from that exact same scene of the different sorts of work in progress. Now, the purpose of this reconstruction effort, which took 5.5 years and cost millions, was to make the Dalai Lama the focus of the palace. The tomb itself contained the Dalai Lama's desiccated remains and other sacred objects and relics. It was completely covered in gilt and encrusted with tens of thousands of gemstones. It towered nearly 5 stories tall and occupied the main chapel inside this new structure, So this is it on the left here. This is a view if you were looking from the south facing north into the structure. And this is the main assembly hall in the center here. So there are other chapels on all three sides and smaller ones on all the upper stories as well. And most of these other roofs that you see in the top were only added later for subsequent Dalai Lamas. Now, this tomb was fittingly named as the Dzamling Genchi, or the unique ornament to the world, allegedly unmatched in its size and splendor throughout all Buddhist history. Now, this effort was also accompanied by a new week-long holiday launched in 1694, timed with the anniversary of the Dalai Lama's death and enlisting thousands of monks, as well as the general citizenry, to make the worship and ritual purification of the dead ruler into a public participatory event. And here's another scene of that inaugural celebration of that holiday in progress, culminating in a procession that would march from the central temple in Lhasa out to the Potala Palace and decamp there for a day's worth of ceremonies and observances, and then circle back around to complete the circuit. Now, the man responsible for overseeing all of these works was the Dalai Lama's successor in power, the Desi Sangye Gyatso. He came from a local political family and grew up at the Dalai Lama's court. He was groomed for leadership from a young age, trained in the secular arts and sciences, tutored in Buddhist doctrines, and eventually initiated by the Dalai Lama into tantric teachings. As a teenager, he was one of the nurses in waiting on the ailing Dalai Lama, who suffered chronic and debilitating bouts of inflammation. Their relationship gained an additional dimension around this time, still a full decade before he took office, as the Dalai Lama started speaking of an even deeper karmic bond between the two, one that rippled back through their past lives and looked forward prophetically into the future. And this is a mature scroll from the late 17th century showing the Desi Sangye Gyatso and the primary sequence of his past lives. There are 20 of them, and they alternate down the sides of the canvas here. Now, throughout this era, the discourse of the Dalai Lama's own identity was also continuing to develop, arboreally extending itself and branching out and incorporating new elements in conversation with real events and their constant interpretation and reinterpretation. This discourse of authority now sent out new tendrils that entangled Sangye Gyatso and bound him not just to the Dalai Lama, but in turn to the institution of kingship and to the basic source of a state's own authority, rooted in the cosmic agency of a perfected Buddhahood, projecting and manifesting itself in both divine and mortal forms. Here are just a few close-ups of some of those select past lives, just to give you an example of the details of this canvas. Now, this understanding of the state's political authority and the identity of the Dalai Lama carried into and informed the Desi Sangye Gyatso's coronation in 1679 as an absolute ruler and new species of Buddhist king, and then found even fuller expression through his own reign in the wake of the Dalai Lama's death, articulated in text and realized concretely in his many works. So this quarter century, spanning roughly from the formal investiture of the Desi in 1679 up through his downfall and death in 1705, is an especially rich and important era for thinking about state and society and for studying Tibetan intellectual and material culture, including but hardly limited to Buddhist thought and practice, and for thinking about them in connection with each other. It's a period whose broad strokes are well known, not only in scholarship, but going back to the 18th century records of Jesuit and Capuchin missionaries. Beyond the broad strokes, though, it's striking that we still know relatively little about the details, especially compared with the burgeoning study of the 18th and 19th century state. Now, this is largely a matter of access. There are a relatively limited selection of historiographical sources, next to no access to archival government documents from this period, and few records from non-Tibetan observers compared to later centuries. But it might also have something to do with the more abstract question of what we're talking about when we talk about the Tibetan state, where we should look, and even how closely. Putting this another way, we could say that what figures like the Dalai Lama and the Desi did care to write about and to do and make and to spend their money on is sometimes simply other than what we might be interested in looking for. So to say that our sources are crucially lacking in some respects is not at all to say that we want for ways of thinking about the state in this period. On the contrary, we have an incredibly rich body of sources. First and foremost, dozens of texts authored by the Desi and directly connected to the giant, incredibly expensive, very visible and often enduring works like the tomb, the palace, and the holiday. And culturally speaking, this was a most prolific time. The late 17th century stands out as arguably one of the more productive periods in the history of the state, one that heralded not only the widespread promotion and publication of knowledge across a broad spectrum of topics, ranging from medical sciences to astronomy and divination to linguistics and poetics, also biographical accounts of astonishing length, detail, and literary sensibility. It's also the era that gave us the royal palace as we know it today, the golden tomb that was then emulated by every subsequent Dalai Lama, and material productions numbering in the tens of thousands and costing millions, not to mention standards for producing them, and new institutions, a generally new cosmopolitan intellectual sensibility for Tibet's aristocratic elites, and so on. And moreover, all of the major works of this era are themselves assiduously documented in texts, again with a breadth and depth, a scriptural backing, and a poetic flourish on top that broker few comparisons. This era leaves its legacy not only on paper, but also in wood, brick, and stone, and gold, silver, and gemstones, and painted scrolls and murals and statuary, and forms of ritual and ceremonial. So here, my research on the Desi and his works straddles that intersection between the study of the state and its productive activities on one side, and the study of Tibetan Buddhist discourse and practice on the other. Now, for many reasons, some incidental and some more methodological, these are pursuits that sometimes run along separate tracks, meaning that the Desi is dealt with either piecemeal or sometimes not at all. Now, the hybridity of his works may be one reason why they've garnered little attention from one or another's side, but it's also what makes them potentially so insightful. So my approach to thinking about this era follows more or less directly from the nature of the works themselves. And this is to study the state through the explication of its cultural forms. Now, by speaking of works, I mean both the textual and material productions together, and in the sense of there being intentional products, meant to be one way and not another. And so more abstractly, this is to ask about the production of the state itself as a kind of meaningful action, making a certain kind of world, and in the process, making themselves in it. Now, thinking about these works also means reading in multiple ways, analyzing the detailed descriptions found in texts, deciphering their arguments and justifications, which often means chasing the Desi down various rabbit holes of Buddhist scriptural and secular knowledges, reading them positively for clues about this social and material world, and finally also reading with an eye for the literary choices for what to say and how. Now, my source base builds out from the Desi's textual corpus in conversation with these three most important and closely connected works at the center of his entire project of rule. All of these works together participated towards the goal of properly acknowledging and responding to the Dalai Lama's death. And this meant formalizing and expanding the discourse of political authority, enlisting the participation of lay and clerical society, marshaling economic, material, and social resources, and channeling them towards the center, where they were put on display and arrested in towering forms like the palace and the golden tomb. So this is roughly a summary of my approach to my current book manuscript and process, which I've titled tentatively The World's Unique Ornament, a Tibetan Buddhist Theory of Kingship. And in this project, I approach this broad topic from three angles: history, theory, and practice. Now, basically by history, I mean fleshing out the social and intellectual background and the events leading into the Desi's political investiture and informing his actions as ruler. And by theory, I mean that I analyze the specific arguments that he makes and their sources, both about the identity of the Dalai Lama and more broadly about the situation and goals of the state. Or to put this another way, both the theological and cosmological dimensions of political authority. And finally, with practice, I delve into these three major examples: the tomb, the palace, and the holiday. So now let me step through these somewhat quickly, and then I'll use the second half of my time to showcase a specific example from my ongoing work on the materiality and the design of the tomb. Okay. So when Sangye Gyatso was enthroned in 1679, this marked the first major inflection point for the Tibetan state. The power bequeathed to him was unprecedented, both in its scope and in how it was defined and portrayed. In fact, he was the fifth person to occupy this office of the Desi, or Depa as it's more commonly called, originally a chief executive serving as an active counterpart to the Dalai Lama's authority, not to mention a moral sop for those parts of governance which were, as they put it, mixed up with evil. But Sangye Gyatso was deliberately and explicitly set apart from his predecessors. He was enthroned as a king in his own right through an elaborate set of rites. His authority was not delegated but bequeathed to him in the fashion of a scion and successor, a surrogate son for this renunciate king. Officially, what he commanded was to be indistinguishable from the Dalai Lama. And at first, this may have simply been a legal fiction, but it was prescient nonetheless. The Dalai Lama had been ailing for years and increasingly finding he couldn't step in to cover all the responsibilities of rule as he had done in the past, especially in periods of transition between the Depas. Indeed, Sangye Gyatso was already effectively participating in running things before he was enthroned, and within 3 years, the Dalai Lama would be dead. So I talk about this history in terms of 3 overlapping movements. First, the development of his office and of political authority more broadly. And second, the circumstances and particulars of his enthronement. And third, I introduce the major texts and works that were undertaken during his tenure. So I start by looking at the ongoing development of the state's self-understanding and the ways that this dovetailed with the Desi Sangye Gyatso's rise to the fore. As I mentioned already, the discourse of authority was both constant in its basic elements and constantly evolving, ramifying through a process of interpretation, reinterpretation, memory, and prognostication in conjunction with changing circumstances. And I want to stress that this was not a straightforwardly linear process. The texts and persons consulted to make sense of reality were often already connected to one another in complex networks. New situations could expose additional facets of sources of knowledge, which could then in turn be read again to better understand other things that had already happened. And prior experiences, perhaps only imperfectly understood at the time, might later become clear and then shed a farther light on into the future. And to see how these processes unfold over the latter half of the 17th century, I look especially to critical junctures like the deaths and successions of the Depas and their allies, the Koshal Khans, and how these moments were handled and interpreted both during and after the fact. In connection, I also introduce evidence from a number of texts, including from the 5th Dalai Lama's own documented visionary experiences, which were both prompted by these crises and consulted to make sense of them. And standing behind them were the Dalai Lama's partnerships in the Tantric Jangter or Northern Treasure tradition, which brought into his discourse its own long history as a self-interpreting community with extensive connections between persons and texts. So all of this is prerequisite for understanding the Desi Sangye Gyatso's rise. He too was initiated into these social networks and tantric traditions and became both a reader and a subject of the same sources of knowledge, including this text, the Dalai Lama's own visions. When the Desi was first nominated as a candidate for office and then eventually enthroned in 1679, it was on the basis not just of his personal qualities, but also his deep relationship with the Dalai Lama and a host of clues and visionary hints from texts old and new, including the Dalai Lama's own experiences. Sangye Gyatso was empowered ritually as a king using a Jangter rite that was expressly selected and implemented for this purpose. This is just the first few pages of the first text of this particular tantric collection, a text known as the Ngawang Rinchen Barwa, or the Blazing Gem of Sovereignty. These same lamas who helped to plan the investiture of the Desi also became his own collaborators in turn after the Dalai Lama's death and aided his effort to curate the scriptural sources and promote certain ways of speaking about the Dalai Lama and implementing works in his name. So this brings me to the second section of my book. And this is where I go knee deep into those long arguments about the Dalai Lama, looking both at the nature of the divinity that inhabited him and acted through him, and the explanations of his mortal decline and death, and the need for a response to it. And more broadly, these arguments also concern the general situation of the state within a larger Buddhist cosmos. This was a cosmos understood as being both subject to influence by powerful, more than human forces, like Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but equally capable of being an agent of order itself, and transforming the world through one's own efforts into something more perfect. And the state enters into this world straddling this distinction between the two. Now, I've already published a little bit on these subjects, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about them here. I'll just mention that I've discussed the argument for the Dalai Lama's identity over 2 articles, one that looks at the divine side and the theology of Buddhahood and Bodhisattvahood, and the other that turns to the arguments for his mortality. So let me just say on this latter point that the Desi makes a very strong case for the reality of the Dalai Lama's decline and death. He builds his entire argument on a premise that even a Buddha can still suffer from its own bad karma, and hence that there is an obligation to acknowledge and respond to that inconvenient but incontrovertible truth. Now, for those of you who are less steeped in Buddhist thought, I want to stress that, at least from my perspective, this is a very radical way of talking about embodied divinity, which otherwise is really not all that uncommon. And fittingly, the Desi had to burrow deep into the canon to find the right vocabulary to make his point. And I don't think this is just an intellectual eccentricity. Rather, I think it has everything to do with the real circumstances of the state. And I would say with the Desi's awareness at some level of the essentially social and constructed nature of kingship, even divine kingship within this Buddhist cosmos. So this is what I find so distinctive and intellectually interesting about the Desi's theoretical stance. He's making a Buddhist case for what I would refer to as a humanist theory of divine kingship, however much that may seem like a contradiction in terms. One that insists that a state that is divine in its origins and its ultimate purposes is nevertheless also necessarily a human construct. Now, of course, the basic components of a Dalai Lama's divinity go much farther back in history, not just to previous Dalai Lamas, but even before that as well. But nowhere do they find such lengthy and well-sourced description as here, in concert with these practical works. And what's different in this case, of course, is the fact that unlike earlier authors, the Desi is writing not off in some monastic cloister, nor in a socio-political vacuum, but in the context of tangible political potential to act, and in the immediate wake of the Dalai Lama's death. In fact, there were any number of other Buddhological options close at hand for speaking about divine agency and its human apparitions. And here we have the Desi landing on the unique explanation that goes so far as to demand that even a Buddha, that most powerful and free state of being imaginable, and the ultimate source of a state's power and authority, is still subject to its own karma. To put this in non-Buddhist terms, when divinity acts to change the world, it is bound to it, dependent upon the participation of a human society. So this is why the working title of my book is A Tibetan Buddhist Theory of Kingship, even if I'm ultimately interested in tying ideas to their concrete forms. The works that define this era of the state are the practical counterpart to this humanism about divine kingship, visible proof of this effort of making and remaking the state and its ruler through one's own activities. Now, before I turn to those works, let me just add that I see this way of thinking about kingship that the Desi provides us as not only more attuned to the evidence, but also preferable to the more utilitarian ways that the Dalai Lama's divinity is sometimes explained, if only as a kind of a default. And on the other side of things, it's an example of Buddhist thinking that is materially grounded in a way that we don't always see in the more airy doctrinal discussions of such concepts and texts. Okay, so now let's take up an example. Now here in the final portion of my book, I take up these 3 case studies, and all of which should be seen as complementary parts of the same project of recognizing and constituting the Dalai Lama, or in Buddhist terms, purifying his karma and assuring that the kingship will endure and continue to rule the new social order. So in our time remaining, I want to showcase some of my work on the materiality of the tomb. Now, I plan to have several chapters on the tomb because it's a window onto so many different facets of the state. For example, it was the quintessential example of a total reorganization in this era of iconometric and iconographic standards for Buddhist material production writ large, which was a major prerogative of the state. These standards were set and promoted by none other than the Desi himself. So this is just one example I've shown from a source book produced contemporaneous with his rule that was uncovered in the Lhasa archives. And the page that I've selected is actually the specifications for the proportions of the type of stupa that was used for the tomb of the 5th Dalai Lama. And also as the final resting place of the Dalai Lama's remains, the tomb provided an occasion for promoting ideas about death, relics, and funerary practices. all of which the Desi also discusses. And then there is the sheer materiality of the thing, the stuff from which it was made and where that stuff came from and how it was put together and how it was talked about. Now, at every turn, the Desi stressed the unprecedented, one-of-a-kind, singular nature of this tomb and all the works that accompanied it. So just to give you a sense of this kind of language that we see, and also the way that the theoretical and the practical aspects of this coalesce, I want to show you an excerpt from an author's colophon of one of his longer texts. And this excerpt that I've chosen is actually part of a much longer autobiographical statement there, summarizing his achievements as ruler, as a way to introduce him and frame him as the author of this text. So it's a little bit of a long quote, and I'm going to read it out here. To purify the karmic obscurations that he had been accumulating for limitless past lives, and the various minor transgressions of his pratimoksha, bodhisattva, and tantric vows, I've newly constructed this great tomb, the world's unique ornament, superior in 13 ways, matching the progression of the levels and paths of the resultant secret mantra vehicle, along with all its accompanying sacred objects in their chapels. And I've established the major holiday centered on its worship, at which are performed inconceivable acts of giving in the 4 types, along with a final procession of worship, known as the Great Worship Assembly, and timed to last 7 days, based on when the Dalai Lama, back in the water dog year, starting on the Dakini day on the waiting side of the 2nd month, entered into the state of a clear light dharmakaya. In other words, began his final meditation in death, and then dwelt in that state until his release 5 days later. In sum, this sort of karmic accumulation and purification has never been accomplished before for anyone, not in India for the previous Buddhas from Krakuchanda up to Shakyamuni, nor Chakravartin kings, or Panditas and Siddhas like the 6 ornaments and the 2 exemplars, nor here in Tibet for kings like our 3 forefathers, or eminent lamas from the various sects like the Sakyapandita Kunga Gyaltsen and the Manjughosha Tsongkhapa the Great, nor in any far-flung lands. Now, from one perspective, this notion of uniqueness has to be contextualized. In fact, the 5th Dalai Lama's stupa stepped into a centuries-old pattern of commemorating the deaths of high lamas and officials both. But he's right that this one took the general form to a new extreme. Here's just another side angle of that tomb itself in its chapel. This tomb doubled the height of the silver stupas for the 3rd and 4th Dalai Lamas at Drepung Monastery, and it was more than 5 times the height of the stupa that was built for the first Depa Sonam Raptin after his death. Instead of costing tens of thousands, it cost millions. Instead of a handful of fine gems, it incorporated thousands of them. It was coated in gold instead of silver or alloyed metals. And instead of meriting a paragraph or 2 of text at most, the Desi documented its every aspect, including its design, labor, materials, and a whole host of related knowledges. The Karchak, or the catalog that the Desi wrote to document this tomb, is nearly 800 folios long. And just for the sake of comparison, in 1645, the 5th Dalai Lama wrote a Karchak cataloging the Tsuklakang, the main temple in Lhasa, and that's 23 folios long. So one way of thinking about this documentary turn is as a rhetorical performance of abundance and splendor, a way of setting the state and its works at a remove. This object is peerless, literally towering above all other past instances of the form. Here, I want to show you a perspective. There was a platform extending out on the 3rd floor for viewing into the kind of receptacle gatehouse area of the stupa. And this is a photograph taken from that site. Now, from another angle, we could also perceive the opposite effect as well. That the effect is that we are being brought closer to the thing in question. I mean that in disclosing all of this background information and specificity, the Desi is opening the hood, so to speak, on a customary practice and showing all of the productive forces and knowledges that go into it. So this is what I want to reflect a little on, these 2 aspects. One, setting the tomb apart as singular, superlative, and unique. The other, portraying it as the outcome of a collaborative effort, the construct of a host of knowledges, persons, and things. In the 7th chapter of the Karchak, the Desi discusses the gyu, or the materials used to build this tomb, and all the other statuary and sacred objects inside the new palace. For anyone interested in Tibetan material culture and social history, this is a really rich and rewarding portion of the entire text. In the beginning of the chapter, the Desi gives an annotated account of the gold on the tomb and all of the tragyan, or the inset gems that were encrusted on its surfaces. Now, here I'm comparing that iconometric chart with a kind of a schematic portrayal of all the different, each of these components had its own name, and he steps through them one by one, listing all of the gems on each surface. He moves part by part from the foundation at the bottom up to the finial at the peak. And in addition to listing the gems and their sources, he pauses to make long digressions into gemological or historical background for each type of stone: pearl, turquoise, amber, diamond, ruby, emerald, and so forth, remarking on their etymologies and varieties, their sources and qualities, and so on. He also ends by giving tallies of each individual type of thing, and then sums of their overall monetary equivalents by the silver and grain standards. Now, the gold covering the tomb, he says, came from three sources: donations, specifically the gifts from the 5th Dalai Lama's embassy to Beijing in 1653, spoils from recent conquests in Central Asia, especially the victories of the Dzungar leader Galdenbo Shukdu Khan over the Yarkand Khanate, which the Tibetans at least saw as bringing new areas under the imperial shade of the white umbrella, so-called, of their Buddhist polity, meanwhile funneling gold and riches back to Lhasa in the form of pious tribute. And finally, gold acquired from subjects of the state through revenues and labor. So in other words, this reflects specific relationships and actions, the fruits of the state's activities at home and abroad. Now, by comparison, the gemstones and jewelry on its surfaces were mostly gifted for this purpose. And this is just basically a documentation of the tally that he himself provides at the end of his long account of the different types of gemstones. They originally functioned as heirlooms or forms of personal wealth or tokens of social status, and were typically donated by secular and clerical elites, including both men and women. And in addition to the loose stones, he also describes several dozen different types of male and female jewelry, compounded out of silver, gold, and gems. For instance, there were several types of jewelry that came from the Rinchen Gencha, or the ceremonial costume of court officials, based on Yuan and Ming era styles and formalized by the Dalai Lama in 1673. So here's a side-by-side comparison. This is a 20th century photo taken by Frederick Spencer Chapman, wearing the traditional costumes. And this is a close-up from that scroll I showed earlier of the Desi's past lives. And you can see, you can look and compare many of the same elements here. For instance, the tomb incorporated 14 serga, or amulet cases. 2 of them were the property of officials in the current government, and 3 came from the bygone Rinpoche and Tsangpa governments, including one set on the balustrade that originally belonged to Karma Phuntsok Namgyal, the erstwhile king of Tsang and foe of the Gelugpas. These are examples of the sorts of jewelry roughly contemporaneous with this period. This is from the Victorian Albert Museum. And there was also one set of the Sokna and Sokhor, the tremendous earrings that these officials wore. Oh, and let me show you also, let me go back here. You can see, if you follow my mouse, there's one right there on the foundation. This is, I think, the same as we see in both this painting and in this photograph. There were also several pieces of pearl, amber, and turquoise that were previously set in the hats of officials, including the Desi himself. So here's a wonderful example of one of these hats. And if you can see on the right here, quite a similar hat. Not just the Desi, but also the ex-Desi Losang Tuptop, and a gem from the hat of the Neudongpa, the local family that traditionally administered the Lhasa area. And other notable pieces came from prominent monks like the Panchen Lama and patrons like the Dzungar Khan. One of the most interesting aspects of this account is just how much was women's wealth. Some of the most prolific givers were women. The single most abundant donor was Tsojung Droma, a lady from the Desi's own Drome house. This is just a kind of an example of the sorts of jewelry that the Desi describes. Out of her own wealth came 4 pieces of amber, one that was the size of a goose egg, another that she gave as a dedicatory offering for merit, and then 2 from her own body jewelry. Also a toe-sized gajamukta, or an elephant pearl, basically a concretion formed in the head of an elephant. And that had been the tigyan, or the peak ornament on a piece of forehead jewelry. And then many more gems, including turquoises, more than 100 red crystals, and 128 large pearls that had lined another piece of her jewelry. So we're not merely speaking metaphorically to say that this monument was made up out of state and society. And all the more so because it's clear that in his text, the Desi was putting a light on that fact and giving ample evidence of just these contributing factors, and showing the provenance of its many components. So I should mention that it's hard enough just to grapple with the complexity of all this ornate material culture on its own terms. Often we have only the Desi's own explanations to help us understand what types of specific pieces he's referring to. This account appears like the tip of a vast iceberg. For all that it shows directly, it hints at much more besides, gesturing to the remarkable variety in Tibetan and Himalayan material culture of this era, as well as the local and translocal networks of things and significations in which they participated. But even as we're left wanting for more information, let me also stress how rare it is to find this level of cultural specificity. It's not hard to find terse lists of objects in historical and biographical literature, especially the lives of eminent monks who were frequent recipients of gifts. It's easy enough to know that Tibetans of this time participated in a rich material culture of adornment and exchange. However, almost never do we find works documented at such great length and with as much attention as we get here in connection with these works in the Dalai Lama's name. So let me end now with a few speculations. As I said, this is work in progress, so I want to test out some of my ideas with you. Some speculations about this dual quality of the material tomb and how it's represented. And as I already hinted, there are the two different themes that come across to me here. And we could say that these are two ways of speaking about value, one economic and the other social. And one making a point about access and uniqueness, and the other about the constructed nature of these state works on the king's behalf. So from one vantage, I think it's fair to say that as a general rule, the narrative arc of the Desi's presentations bends towards money, as it were. Typically, after giving pages of information about the things themselves, he always ends by counting it all up and putting price tags on everything, as he does for this tomb, for instance. And this is just his tallies of the material components of the tomb, the gemstones and the jewelry, the gilt, the internal contents, which are too sacred for him to talk about specifically. And then he sums it all up. This is exemplary of the form. And in this example, he's only counting the material costs. This astonishing sum does not also include the labor expenses, both for provisioning craftsmen and sponsoring the necessary ceremonies, to say nothing of the thousands of other sacred objects, the construction of the palace, the cost of sponsoring the new holiday in Lhasa and at other sites across the realm, all of which he also very carefully tallies and adds up. So what is the Desi trying to tell us with all of these sums? A straightforward reading might recall his insistence on being unmatched in history and conclude that the point is more or less self-evident. This is how much it costs to make this thing, how much it's worth, how much, in other words, the state is willing to spend in the name of its king. More crassly, it's the economic equivalent of one unit of the fifth Dalai Lama. From this perspective, the point of all the detail is just to show us the receipts. Converting everything in the end to monetary standards of exchange could be a way to communicate that wealth and abundance are what matter. This sort of quantifiable splendor provides both a standard of success and a means of comparison, hence a way to measure the effectiveness or superiority of the state with respect to the social world that it rules over. The fifth Dalai Lama's golden tomb would have played a special symbolic role in this respect, not just because of its literal and metaphorical centrality to the state, but also because no single thing was worth more. Nothing really comes close. So not only is it exemplary of the state's richness and potential, but also of their incomparability. That is, of the extreme distance between the state and everyone else in their capacity as creative agents. Some contemporary socioeconomic data can add a little perspective here. For instance, in 1661, the Dalai Lama augmented the Drongme estates by awarding them with a new pair of properties that he valued at 50 households with an annual taxable income amounting to 2,500 khel. And this is the grain standard that would be used for basically quantifiable purposes of census and taxation and so forth. Now, by comparison, we can see that the material on the tomb alone had an equivalent value of roughly 18.75 million khel, or in other words, about 7,500 years worth of yield on those properties. And what about labor? Another entire chapter of the Desi's Karchak documents the workers who built the palace and everything in it. And this is another rich and incredibly interesting chapter, I think, deserving of more future study. In addition to information about the names and the jobs and the sources of the material resources, it also gives us information about monthly provisions. And they vary according to both the type of craft and the different guild hierarchies of the carpenters, the woodworkers, stonemasons, bricklayers, smiths, metalworkers, painters, textile weavers, and dyers, and so on. So here I've just picked out a couple selected examples from the higher end and the lower ends of the spectrum. Now, just for the sake of a comparison, and you can sort of see that basically the higher up you are, the more barley you get, the better quality you get, the more meat you get, and you get better tea, more of a kind of luxury goods. The lowest grades are probably the leather workers and some of the blacksmiths. Now, just for the sake of comparison, let me err very much on the side of generosity and stipulate an ideal typical skilled worker earning the equivalent of around 150 kel for 1 year of work on the palace. So even in this case, the value of the tomb's materials equals the combined annual wages for 125,000 such laborers. But hopefully these calculations and comparisons already betray something of their own absurdity. One point of making it all about money, I suspect, is to say that there's really no point in trying to find the tomb's equal in anything. By giving all of his works equivalent price points in grain, the Desi does beg all sorts of comparisons like this, and they grow increasingly ludicrous. Would we be wrong to infer that the purification of the divine king's karma is in some sense the equivalent of 6.25 million sheep? And if not, then why assign a medium for their comparison at all? I mean that the very fact that the tomb would come out ahead in any and every such comparison is a way of calling attention to the question of what one can and cannot compare. It calls us to reflect on the limits of value. So one effect of these works perhaps is to make the state and its ruler stand apart from the ordinary social world. We could say that the tomb holds a kind of absolute value, to borrow a term from the anthropologist Annette Wiener. And as she suggests, this sort of thing draws its power and authenticity from that fact of being set apart, not unlike the kingship for which it is a symbol. It's not that the Desi is giving us the means to figure out, say, exactly how many wheels of tea or man hours or acres somebody could hypothetically earn by cashing out a Dalai Lama. What he's showing is that one cannot do such things. Okay, but then this leads me to ask, does this idea of the tomb as a token of a kind of transcendent or absolute value, certainly befitting of a divine king, does this go far enough? I still think it doesn't fully account for where its worth actually comes from or for the nature of our evidence. When we speak in these terms, we're still thinking in monetary terms. And this may accurately reflect the form of the Desi's accounts, or as I said, the way that everything bends towards money. But then again, the bulk of his attentions show us something else entirely. The amount of attention that he lavishes on the gemstones and jewelry compared to the gold, say, is in inverse proportion to their monetary value. What this choice suggests is that there are other kinds of value caught up in the tomb as well. This is just another excerpt of a really robust and rich scene of offerings to the throne, again, taken from this scroll of the Desi's past lives. And I've been pulling little details from this. It shows both Tibetan ministers and monks and foreign patrons as well. Now, I've already mentioned how the gold was a medium for solidifying the constitutive foreign and domestic activities of the state, namely expansion and tribute, patronage and taxation, dharmic order flowing out and gold flowing in and arresting itself at the center. The value of the gemstones and jewelry was primarily intellectual and social. It begins from their own precious nature and the specific aesthetic, material, therapeutic, or magical properties associated with them. Some specimens were valued for their unique size and shape or their unusual patterning, and many were important because of their owners. They could also accrue other sorts of value over time on account of their associations. As an example, there are 2 lumps of turquoise of the Gyujang variety that are set into the foundation. One of them is notable or singled out by the Desi for its especially unique size, and the other was reputed to have been the Layu, or the soul turquoise, of Lalung Pelgi Dorje. And he's a famous hero from Tibetan royal lore, and in this era was identified as a past life of the Desi Sangye Gyatso himself. He's actually in this painting. If you follow my mouse, he's right here on the right side with the bow and arrow. Now, the Layu is a type of thing that in Tibetan culture is explicitly linked to its owner's vitality, as its name suggests, and in turn, the vitality of their family who retain it as an heirloom. And we could generalize this point in broadly Mausian terms by saying that, like the Layu, if less overtly so, the ornaments that went on to the Dalai Lama's stupa carried to it forms of value that were accrued on account of the qualities and histories and relationships that they carried. Another source of worth lay in the cultural variety too. Many types of stones or styles of jewelry, the Desi associated with places and peoples, including nearby regions like Tsang and Kongpo, but also India and China, and the Mongol and Turkic peoples that he refers to variously as Sok, Drugu, Hor, and the Tuhor, or the Upper Hor, and sometimes Gasser, which today is sometimes used to say Russia, but I think means something like East Turkestan here. For instance, the tomb incorporated 55 pieces of a type of jewelry called the Tratsom, which literally means something like a cluster arrangement of inset gems. And the Desi describes them somewhat tersely as ornaments from the Tuhor region that are set with diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. And he notes that this region was reputed for the diamond jewelry that its wealthy residents wore. So that was a marker of its cultural difference in participating in its value. Okay, so with these few examples, already we see some of the core themes that factor into the ownership and display and circulation of material wealth, things that the Desi was highlighting by his lengthy descriptions in his text. And by calling attention to these features and connections, we're able to see how a broader web of significance also played a part in the making of this monument. He singles out gemstones on account of their unique qualities. Some of them even get personal names. Objects have a historical heft and are highlighted for their association with persons or families or their history of movement. A single object can implicate multiple persons and places or recall key eras and events in history. Some pieces dragged long political and social tendrils behind them, linked to old bloodlines, prior conquests, and changes of political fortune. And all of this significance is encrusted onto the tomb, congealing, making it like a center of gravity at the hub of a larger circulation of persons and things and meanings. So I'm going to stop here. I'll just add that you can go even further in this direction, looking at the disclosure of information. We would also note, for instance, how the Desi shines a light on the physical and ritual labor that went into making the tomb. We could incorporate the way he showcases his own intellectual efforts to dictate the norms of production and set the standards for making things and adequately writing about them in texts, basically performing an example of what you have to know in order to make and talk about things in this way. You know, my larger point is that the materiality of the object and the nature of its representation help us to see the tomb in these two ways at once, both incomparable and unique, and also a social production. And my hypothesis is basically that it's in these terms that we can begin to speak of the tomb as a symbol of king and state, which, if you'll recall, is echoing the same language that I used to talk about the Desi's theological and cosmological arguments. Okay, so that's it. And by showing you this example, I just wanted to show you a taste of the broader body of material I'm working with, and the richness of the sources and the attention to detail we find, and the way it carries us both towards intellectual history and studying Buddhism, and towards thinking about society and material culture in ways that the Desi himself blends together throughout his works. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. So the floor is open for questions. Maybe I can begin. The Desi sounds like an especially obsessive guy. And so I wanted to ask essentially how unique is he? And particularly when it comes to these arguments about the nature and mortality of the Dalai Lama and how to explain his decline and passing, which is something that may resonate even today with in certain contexts. So how is this carried forward? What is the legacy of what's being developed here?
Yeah. Well, of course, like it always raises some hackles when you start to say things like unique or new. And of course, there's the initial issue of filtering out the rhetoric of uniqueness, which is everywhere here, absolutely everywhere. and what like I would actually myself as a scholar stake a claim to being a little bit different or unusual. So just to talk first about, you mentioned this issue of mortality. From one angle, it's whenever I kind of share this with a Tibetan Buddhist studies audience, people will say like, oh, well, there's really nothing new under the sun here. People have been talking about embodied divinity in so many ways, and depending on how sort of broad an interpretive frame you want to take, it all is the same as Nagarjuna, and so there's any kind of number of ways that you could say this. What's really striking for me is that I didn't get into this in this talk because I wanted to sort of leave out the more explicitly Buddhological stuff. He pulls out this term, karma avashesha, which means the residual or leftover karma of an already perfected being. And this is an idea that comes out of a Mula Sarvastivada narrative text, very old text that made its way into the Tibetan canon through the Vinaya literature. So first he identifies and highlights and uses this term to anchor his entire argument, which itself is very notable, I think. And second, he then goes out of his way to marshal other ways of talking about karma, ways that we find in Mahayana literature, in Bhaviveka and Haribhadra, and Prajnaparamita exegesis, which don't use that vocabulary. And also he delves into the tantric literature, especially the Guhya Garbha corpus. And again, like none of that stuff has this idea in it, but he's making a kind of interpretive argument that they're all talking about the same thing. And what they're all talking about is a being that is not only has traversed the bhumis and levels and sort of used up all their own karma and escaped the sort of passivity of being subject to death and rebirth, and has acquired the ability to do these things by their own free will as they would. And then on top of that, to the extent that they exist at all and make any sort of effect on the human world, they are subject to their own karma. This is a really like odd idea. It's basically saying that Buddhas have bad karma too, and then we have to do something about it. And it's that we have to do something about it part that I think really matters for understanding why he would go out of his way to make this choice. And as I said, if you just want to talk about the superpowers of bodhisattvas or Avalokiteshvara, the Dalai Lama, you don't have to lift a finger. It's a piece of cake. There's like so many sources to choose from. Now, as far as tracing the kind of future impact of this particular ways of thinking, that's a larger project and one I've just sort of started to get into myself. In the article that I published in Jayabs, I gave a couple of examples that I found. For instance, there's a way of foregrounding the fact of the already purified and perfected nature of bodhisattvas and Buddhas. That's very, very, it's a key part of this argument. It kind of anchors everything, this already perfected nature, even of beings that we think of typically as bodhisattvas. And for instance, I found this all over the descriptions of the Qianlong emperor that we find by the Tuken Losang Chogi Nyima, who is a member of the Qing court about 100 years after the Desi. And it's very well known that Qianlong was portrayed as Manjushri, the bodhisattva, and we find it reorganized in the same way to sort of prioritize the prior perfection and subsequent imperfection and kind of mortal finitude of him, which I mean, I see these two as being very, I think there's the kind of a rhetorical style and a kind of grammar of divinity that we see develops in the Desi's works. Another subtler impact is I mentioned very briefly in this talk, the curation of the sources for talking about these kinds of things in the first place. For instance, as I mentioned, the discourse of a Dalai Lama's authority was kind of growing over the 17th century. And the main like generative engine of this transformation was the sort of folding of the Dalai Lama into the discourses of prophecy and rebirth of the Jangter patriarchs and the connections between them. And so the Dalai Lama brought with him a kind of an association with the Tibetan kings of the past. And through the king Tri Songdetsen, who is a subject of much tantric prophetic literature because of his associations with Padmasambhava, basically it enables like a a tremendous ramification of the possible ways of finding other past lives, connecting it to other prophetic texts and so forth. So you can never think of just the Dalai Lama's past lives as a kind of a self-contained linear thing. You have to include among other people, the Dorje Drak Tulku lineage, the Terdak Lingpa, and these people were themselves discovering texts that were then adding new prophetic information, which if you already knew the connections in place, it then allowed you to just keep making connections and connections to other people, to other texts that talk about other people who reveal texts that talk about the first. And so this is how the Desi himself was, I mentioned, like a branch on the larger tree of this discourse. And this is just to say that this sort of created a certain kind of curated selection of texts for speaking about people. And one thing I found again was that you look at some later local histories in Tibetan, and I found stuff about Tsongkhapa, for example, that spoke prophetically about Tsongkhapa's past lives using the exact same body of sources. And quoting from the Vaidya Serpa, which is one of the Desi's later works where he elaborates these ideas in their kind of fully formed shape. So, I mean, those are the two things.
Let me stop you here.
Yeah.
Let me stop you here so we can get more questions. Marianne?
Okay, so you're talking to a non-Tibet person here, right? And so keep it simple. From what I understand, you're focused closely on the Desi Sangye Gyatso's works in order to explore the ways that he is defining kingship in somewhat new or in a new kind of way that gives it, that highlights both the humane and the divine. And I wonder how your interpretation of the Desi and his role and his work differs from other scholarly interpretations. In other words, what's new here, not from the point of view of what all sources did you use, but what's new here in your in the image that you're bringing forward of the Desi and his particular contribution to the construction of the Tibetan state. And so for the purposes of answering that, because I'm not a Tibetologist, if you want to give me one or two quick ways of saying, well, others have seen him this way and I see him this way, that would be great.
Sure. The shortest answer is what's new is that I'm reading his texts. And I'm not trying to be dismissive. I mean, some of these texts were hard to get, and now it's because of the internet and so forth, and simply going to archives. We have everything basically. But some of those texts, especially the big ones, have been around and were published through the PL 480 program in the 80s, and so it's not like they weren't around. It's just kind of hard to know what to do with them because they have this like saturated quality where if you're interested in political history, there's too much damn Buddhism in there. And if you're interested in Buddhism, it's what are you doing reading this stuff by this secular, like King's Hand, when you could be reading stuff from the Gelugpas and so forth. So that's part of it. It's just kind of access. And I don't know. I don't want to say anything bad. I think it's always been well known that the Desi was the loyal and devoted right-hand man of the Dalai Lama. And the ways that we think about the Desi are sometimes a function of the ways that we think about the Dalai Lama. And this is something I talk about a little in that earlier chapter in my book. So, one position, which is, you see it in Tucci's early works and then in Luciano Pedic, and repeated in sort of shorter terms by Stein and Richardson and some more recent scholars. They take a view that by rights, the Dalai Lama was never really in charge at all, or ought not to have been at least. And, it was the Koshuk Khans who were really the ones calling the shots, appointing the first Desi and so forth. I've found no evidence for this, by the way. And Pedic's evidence doesn't really check out. But, what this leads to then is this, because it's evident that the Dalai Lama was in charge, you then have to create a narrative of, the actions he took were effectively ways of wresting power away from more rightful owners of it, including not just the other, the Depas, but especially the Koshuk Khans. And so this is one reason why I highlight in my history on these moments of transition. It's very coincidental that the deaths of the Khans and the deaths of the Depas and the successions of the Khans often overlapped very, very closely. So there's a crux point in 1659 after Gushi Khan died, And then Sonam Raptin, the first Depa, died. And then a successor to Gushi Khan, his son Dayan Khan, had to be named, and a new Depa had to be picked. And then again in 1668, something similar happens. And so these were traditionally seen as moments where the Dalai Lama basically took advantage of his weak rivals and sort of like stole a chair, basically. And I just don't see the evidence that way. What I see is like I said, the best way I can think about it is that the idea of him as the authority was constant, but also constantly developing. That it does grow and it does become more complex, but I just see it as a projection. This idea that he had to somehow scheme his way into power, and that what he was doing was a means to other ends. I see it as being the end in itself. Basically, he was acting to be a king, not acting to become a king or to present himself as one. Well, in some sense, these are the same thing. But I think this kind of scheming portrayal is we're just reading our own assumptions back into the evidence.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Ian, can you see the question that is posed in the chat?
Yeah, 1 second. Yeah. Oh, Peldingil, hi. My question is, how do you characterize the Desi's relationship with the Khoshut Mongol rulers who, according to certain inter-Asian historians, yeah, this is what I was just talking about, Khoshut Khanate, or at least a government of alliance. No, I'm aware that I'm working primarily with Tibetan sources, and that therefore, these are not like the hard line to the truth. It's a perspective. But as I just mentioned, I found that so Tucci, for instance, has this assumption that the Dalai Lama was a church figure, and church figures are not supposed to be in charge of a state, and it was a kind of a failed experiment. That he was able to gain a lot of power through his actions, but eventually things went back into secular hands. And a lot seems to hinge on this assumption that the Gushi Khan was in charge in the beginning. And for instance, the main piece of evidence is that he was the one who appointed the Depa Sonam Raptin. And I haven't exhaustively dealt with this question. It's something I'm really curious about now, and I wish I had library access, to be honest. It's not a good COVID research question. But almost nobody cites any sources for this. The only person who really cites any sources is Pedig. And what he cites is Sumpa Khenpo, writing about 100 years later, Longdo Lama, also a later scholar, and the Longwei Mikbu, which is like a late 19th or early 20th century history and collection of official government seals, which has like a short kind of summary of this. And none of that evidence says anything to support this idea. It's ambiguous at best. And actually, Longdo, for instance, says the exact opposite. So I don't think that claim, I haven't seen convincing evidence of that yet. That's one thing. And then, this leads to these assumptions, like, so for Pedig, then it means basically Dayan Khan and Tenzin Dalai Khan never really were conceived as being in charge. And he ascribes this basically to their weakness, like they were too weak to do it. But again, that feels like putting the cart before the horse to me. And so one kind of interesting thing, if you look at the Dalai Lama's autobiography, the way that they handled the funerals and the enthronements of these really crucially important allies to them. And so the enthronement of Dayan Khan, for instance, they basically like messed it up. There's kind of a ritual failure that nobody knew how to do it. So he put Sonam Raptin in charge, his kind of right-hand man, and he might have deliberately, tanked it, as we say. But he had to basically go find people who knew, who were like Lukla Kepa, learned in the customs of the Mongols, because they didn't know how to conduct the ceremony in the first place. Then there was like a complete misunderstanding where there were supposed to be gifts offered to the throne to recognize Dayan Khan, and all of the people in his party that he brought with them thought they were gifts for them too. And it created this really kind of awkward misfire where, sort of a kind of a friction of a mutual misunderstanding for a minute. And the Dalai Lama basically talks about this as a waste of his time. This is a perspective again, but it doesn't look to me like any kind of recognition of a subordinate position of the Tibetans. It looks like efforts to keep reproducing a crucially important relationship that was constitutive of the state. The Dalai Lama admits that our project cannot possibly succeed without its dependence on these patrons. But let me just end by saying that I think the more abstract issue is that often there's a tendency to look at this history with the basic question being, who was in charge of whom? And, turning it into this, like, okay, somebody at the end, I think of it as like the kind of Highlander version of this, that there's got to be one in the end. So which one, and trying to work out who it was. And I think this is like a crucially important question now, looking back from the present, this is one of the reasons why we read this history at all, is because the answer to that question really matters. It has really tremendous stakes now, but it's not clear to me that it was a question motivating the activities of the agents themselves. So I'll end there.
Well, that's a great place to end since we're out of time. So thank you very, very much for a very stimulating talk, and go about your business, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's great to see or not see you, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everybody.